All right, so we're back with Thomas Taylor's dissertation on Aristotle's philosophy. We tried this yesterday, and there was bad weather, and my internet was not doing well, so we canceled that. We'll start right back where we tried to start yesterday. So, chapter 17. Sorry. Wait, yeah, 17. Roman numeral moment. Okay. So, this is an Aristotle quote. We're talking about the notion of time. Neither, however, is time without mutation, for when there is no change in our thoughts, or if there is, but we are ignorant of it, then it does not appear to us that any time has elapsed. And that's a weird argument, because he even says here, if there is mutation or change, but we are ignorant of it, then we don't notice that any time has elapsed. And from that, he seems to conclude that time inherently can't be without mutation. Time involves the concept of change, but he appeals to like our notion of time or our sense of time in a way where he admits that we could be ignorant of changes, and yet it seems like no time has passed. Yet clearly time has passed, so it's just a weird way of going about it, in my opinion, but I'll start this section again. Neither, however, is time without mutation. For when there is no change in our thoughts, or if there is, but we are ignorant of it, then it does not appear to us that any time has elapsed, as neither did it to those in Sardis who are fabled to have slept with the heroes when they awoke. For they conjoined the prior with the posterior now, and made them to be one, not taking into account the intermediate time through not having had a sensible perception of it. Okay, so that this seems to be a reference, I don't know if this is Homeric or what, but seems to be a reference to a group of people who slept for a long time and didn't realize the time passed, not noticing the intervening time. As therefore, if there were no other now, but one and the same, there would be no time. Thus also, when it is concealed from us that there is a different time, then the intermediate time does not appear to exist. So he was talking about the issue of the identity of instants in time. He set out kind of the problematic in assuming various things, that like all nows are the same, then any length of time wouldn't make sense as a timeline because the start point and the end point would be identical. So, yeah, he kind of problematized time in a variety of ways, hasn't really landed on his own firm definition. But now we're looking at time doesn't seem to be possible without mutation. So going on, if therefore it then happens to us that we do not imagine there is time, when we do not distinguish any mutation, but the soul appears to remain in one and indivisible, but when we sensibly perceive and distinguish mutation, then we say there has been time. If this be the case, it is evident that time is not without motion and mutation. Okay, so this is a Simplicius quote, maybe slightly paraphrased by Thomas Taylor from Simplicius's commentary on Aristotle's physics. Aristotle, says Simplicius, having shown that time is not motion, in the next place shows that neither is it without motion entirely. For it is the province of one who is endued with science to show in things which are allied by nature in what they differ and what they have in common. But that time cannot exist, and that it is not possible to assume it without motion, he demonstrates as follows. Time without motion cannot be perceived by sense. That which cannot be sensibly perceived without motion cannot be assumed without motion, because it entirely subsists with motion. Time, therefore, subsists together with and cannot be conceived without motion. But that it cannot be sensibly perceived without motion, he demonstrates from this, that when there is no change in our thoughts, or when we are ignorant that there is any change in them, when we do not think that any time has elapsed, as being unable to form a conception of time without a conception of motion. And that this is the case is evident to us from sleep, for when we wake, after having slept without perturbation, we have no conception of the intermediate time. This also is evident in strenuous intellectual perceptions or actions. For the mind, being attentive to these, we do not think that there has been any intermediate time, though frequently a long time has elapsed, for not from being moved ourselves, but from receiving a conception of motion, we, together with this, conceive time as being consubsistent with motion. Hence, Aristotle says that there is no change in our thoughts because, in consequence of the mental perception of motion, though the mind is immovable, the co-sensation of time is produced. For on the contrary, we may see that those who, when suffering pain, or who want or desire anything, in consequence of conceiving that a motion of this kind is much, conceive also that time is much. So if you want something very badly, the measure of that motion is intense, and so the time you're waiting for the thing that you are anticipating seems greater. Hence, someone says in the comedy, "'Twill surely never be day, yet long ago I heard the cock." And another says, "Those who desire grow daily old." But that those who do not mentally follow motion have not any co-sensation of time, we know every day, as I have said, from sleep. Aristotle, however, confirms this from that longer sleep, which those in the island of Sardis are fabled to have slept with the heroes. For the 9 sons of Heracles, which he had from the daughters of the Thespian Thestia, dying in Sardis, it was said, till the time of Aristotle, and perhaps of Alexander, the interpreter of Aristotle. Alexander was a 2nd century peripatetic, 2nd century AD, that their bodies remained incorruptible and entire, and exhibited the appearance of men asleep. The following singular circumstance is also said by Eudemus to have happened at Athens. At a public sacrifice, certain persons had a banquet in a subterranean cavern, and being intoxicated, they and their servants slept 2 days and nights. One of them, indeed, happened to wake, but as soon as he saw the stars, again returned to sleep. On the following day, when they awoke, that part of the festival called the Koriotis was celebrated, from which they understood what had happened. But the Koriotis was the 3rd day of the festival called Apatoria, just as the first day was Dorpia, the second Anerusis, and the 4th Eptibda. Eptibda. After the sacrifice, therefore, of the 2nd day, they slept the following day and night, and thought that the remaining 4th day was the Koriotis instead of the 3rd. From all that has been said, therefore, it is evident that time will not be without motion and mutation. And it seems like a very obvious conflation of our concept of time, or our notion of time, and time itself. Like, the fact that we don't perceive time without motion doesn't entail that it's impossible ontologically, physically without motion. I also agree that it can't be, but it's like not a valid way of concluding that, I think. But since we investigate, back to Aristotle, what time is, let us assume, beginning from hence, what it is belonging to motion. Okay, so it has to do with motion, so let's consider time as it relates to motion. For together with motion, we have also a sensible perception of time. For even in darkness, and when we are passive to nothing through the body, if there is nevertheless a certain motion in the soul, there immediately also appears to have been some time. So it doesn't have to be physical motion, it can just be thoughts. For it is evident from hence, maybe Taylor, maybe Simplicius, it is evident from hence that when Aristotle contends, as in his books on the soul, that the energies of the soul are immovable, he only means that they are immovable according to physical motions, but not according to another species of motion which belongs to incorporeal natures, whose essence is separate from that of body. So when Aristotle calls soul an unmoved mover, he means it is not physically moved while bringing about physical motion, which is interesting because we just saw Plotinus had the same kind of concept. But yeah, that's contrasted with the absolute unmoved mover of Aristotle, which moves in no respect, is thought thinking itself, but it's not a motion of thought. It's sort of like all thoughts together in one eternal act there. And that's truly unmoved. There's no mutation there. Okay. There immediately also appears to have been some time with any mental motion. But when likewise some time appears to have elapsed, together with this, there seems also to have been some motion, so that time is either motion or something belonging to motion. Since therefore it is not motion, it is necessary that it should be something belonging to motion. But since that which is moved from something to something, and since all magnitude is continuous, motion is consequent to magnitude. For because magnitude is continuous, motion also is continuous. Because the property of the genus will necessarily be in the species. And because motion, also time, for as much motion as there was, so much time likewise also appears to have elapsed. But prior and posterior primarily subsists in place, and here indeed in the position of the parts. Since, however, there are prior and posterior in magnitude, it is also necessary that these should be in motion, analogous to the prior and posterior which are there. Moreover, there are also prior and posterior in time, because one of these is always consequent to the other. But the prior and posterior of these do not in reality differ from motion, but only in essence and definition. Okay. Okay, so, this is a little confusing. The prior and posterior of these. It seems that it's referring to prior and posterior in time. So the temporal prior and posterior don't in reality differ from motion, but only in their essence and definition. So he said before that time wasn't the same as motion, but here he's saying prior and posterior in time don't in reality differ from motion. So time differs from motion and is not the same, but prior and posterior of time don't differ in reality from motion. It's a little convoluted. We'll see where he goes with this. We likewise know time when we give a boundary to motion, distinguishing prior and posterior. And we then say there has been time when we receive a sensible perception of prior and posterior in motion. But we distinguish them by apprehending these to be another and another, and also by conceiving that there is something between different from these. For when we understand that the extremes are different from the middle, and the soul says that there are two instants, the one prior and the other posterior, then we say that this is time. But that which is bounded by instants appears to be time. And let this be admitted. When therefore we have a sensible perception of the now as one, and there is not anything as prior and posterior in motion, or when we perceive it as the same, and not belonging to a certain prior and posterior, then there does not appear to have been any time, because neither was there any motion. So he's trying to argue that prior and posterior time, in reality, in the facts of the matter, involve motion. Prior and posterior in motion and time seem to be the same, and yet time isn't simply motion. It is like probably the measure of motion is the right way to put it, and these limits, prior and posterior, maybe lead us towards that definition of measure of time, measure of motion. But when we perceive prior and posterior, then we say there is time, for time is this, the number of motion according to prior and posterior. Number or measure, I guess, could each be fair. Time is the number of motion according to prior and posterior. Time, therefore, is not motion, unless so far as motion has number. An indication of which is this, that we judge of the more and the less by number, but of a greater and less motion by time. Time, therefore, is a certain number. Since, however, interesting also that that's how Kant describes the, what do you call it? Transcendental aesthetic of time, that it is like joined to basically quantity, successive numbers. That's like the primitive mental precondition of time for Kant. Time, therefore, is a certain number. Since, however, number is twofold, for we call both that which is numbered and that which is numerable number, and also that by which we number, time is that which is numbered and not that by which we number. But that by which we number is different from that which is numbered. Simplicius, footnote 5. The whole intention, says Simplicius, of what is said is this, that as motion possesses its continuity from the magnitude in which it is, so likewise prior and posterior are appropriately derived from motion, subsisting according to position in magnitude, and from motion, time. For in magnitude, the prior, for instance, is where the champions in the games stand, but the posterior, the extremity of the stadium. But in motion, the prior is motion according to the first point, but the posterior according to the posterior point. In magnitude, however, the prior is always consubsistent with the posterior, for the first point and the posterior subsist together. But in motion, the prior being destroyed, the posterior succeeds. Prior and posterior, however, are not the same with motion, as neither in magnitude are prior and posterior the same with magnitude. So motion is like a species of magnitude, and then prior and posterior is something that exists according to magnitude. It's added on to magnitude or motion. But though in subject they are the same, yet they differ in definition. Thus 5 things are in their subject wood, but they are 5 according to number. And the subject indeed of motion is the energy of that which may be moved, or activity of that which may be moved, but the prior and posterior in motion are number and order in a thing of this kind. So I guess that's what Aristotle meant by the reality. Prior and posterior don't differ in the substrate that they're describing, but they differ in the definition. They apply to a given substrate, motion, but differ in definition from motion itself. In like manner, in magnitude, in which there are prior and posterior, the subject perhaps is pillars, but prior and posterior are the order in them. Thus, therefore, Aristotle, separating the prior and posterior in motion, in the next place inquires what the essence is of prior and posterior by which they differ from motion. Thus, in a line, as long as we conceive it to be one and continued, we do not conceive one part of it to be prior by position and another posterior. So the line itself doesn't inherently involve the notion of prior and posterior, but when we divide and distinguish it by points, then immediately we make one part of it prior by position and another posterior, and the extremities of the line different from the middle, which is comprehended by the extremities. Thus also in motion, we do not conceive in it prior and posterior unless we divide and distinguish it as it were into 2 parts, and receive a sensible perception as of another and another. By what, therefore, do we distinguish it? Certainly not by a point, for a point has not position. We distinguish it, therefore, after another manner. For I call that the former motion with which I moved, if it should so happen in walking. So it's not a point that we get the prior in time. So how do we distinguish it? Therefore, after this manner. For I call that the former motion, so the prior is defined with which I moved, if it so should so happen in walking, with which I moved. But the posterior, that with which I shall be moved. Okay, so prior, I mean, it's pretty clear he's just talking about first what's happening with the motion initially, and then what will happen with the motion, so that the distinction arises from the one being past and the other future, but the past and future are time. Hence, time and the prior and posterior are the same when these are distinguished. So time then is, you could also say, a species of the prior and posterior. The prior and posterior also subsists according to position, according to like ontological hierarchies as well, of necessity. And then here in time, prior and posterior subsist in another way. But they are distinguished when nows or instants are noticed by the soul, the one as the beginning and the other as the end of motion. Yeah, Simplicius too is kind of backing up this like observer-dependent notion of time. That's something to explore, why it seems to be such an observer-dependent kind of concept. But all right. They are distinguished when nows or instants are noticed by the soul, as one the beginning, the other is the end of motion, for then we immediately form a conception of the time which is between the nows and which is different from them. Frequently, likewise, directing our attention to one now as the end of the past and the beginning of the future, we again obtain a conception of the prior and posterior time. Okay. So it's a number on time, prior and posterior in time. That act of measurement seems to be dependent on the soul from everything that's been said, which is interesting. Souls are said to be the measure of time by Proclus. That's one of the essential functions of the soul, is to measure out time. Hence, the conception of time is everywhere produced by apprehending the prior and posterior of motion. Well, here, that's more literally true. The concept of time is produced by apprehending the prior and posterior of motion. Whether time itself is produced by that is sort of open for interpretation as far as what we've read so far. And this is apprehended when motion is assumed as another and another. That is, when it is numbered. For number is not of one thing, nor entirely of the same thing, but of that which possesses another and another. So that time is the number of motion, as numbered according to prior and posterior, the concept of time. And that it is indeed the number of motion is evident, since we form a judgment of everything which is more or less by number. But we form a judgment of the more and less of motion by time, for the motion is more, which with an equal velocity consumes more time, and that is less, which consumes less time. Hence, it is concluded in the third figure that time is a certain number. So this is a third figure syllogism. We don't have to go through the letters to make that clear. It's clear, though, time is a species, or that by which we judge the more and less is number. Time judges the more and less of motion. Therefore, time is a certain type of number. But that it is necessarily added according to prior and posterior is evident, since motions indeed are numbered, and many at once, as when a man at one and the same time is increased in bulk, and becomes hot, and moves from place to place, for then he moves with 3 motions at once. Yet such a number of motion is not time, for that which is according to, but that which is according to prior and posterior. So it's not just the number of every kind of motion or any number of motion, but motion numbered according to prior and posterior. Nor is it wonderful if Aristotle, defining time to be that which is numbered of motion, does not mention in the definition the numerable for number, the numerable but number. For that which is numerable is called number in the same manner as that which may be measured is called a measure. Thus, monadic number, which is measured by unities, is called a measure, a number of oxen and a number of horses. Thus again, a wooden bushel and a bushel of corn are called measures, and so in other things. And numerating number indeed is not adapted to time, for it is divided and not continued, but numerable number may also be continued as a spear of 11 cubits. That which is numerable also is twofold, one according to quantity, as when we say 2 or 3 motions, but the other according to order, as when we speak of motion according to prior and posterior. Okay, so ordinality rather than I guess like numericity or quantity. Ordinality versus quantity, I think. One according to quantity, one according to order. Aristotle therefore wishes to show that time is the number of motion, but both as numbered and as numbered according to order, for this is its proper number. For there is a number common to motion, to oxen, and to horses. When therefore Aristotle says, that which is bounded by instants appears to be time, and let this be admitted, he indicates in what manner time is the number of motion, that it is the number of it as numerable and bounded, and not as that which numerates. For that which is numerable in motion, and is so bounded as another and another, is prior and posterior in motion, and not motion. For the number of prior and posterior of motion is time, not the number of motion itself. So the technical Aristotelian definition for time then will be the number of prior and posterior of motion. Time is the number of the prior and posterior of motion, if we want to memorize that. Hence time is the enumeration of many motions according to prior and posterior, for it is not the prior and posterior in magnitude, since the prior and posterior in it abide together, but the prior and posterior of time do not abide. But since it appeared to Alexander, says Simplicius, that the definition of time here given by Aristotle has not the same meaning with that given by Plato, let us compare their definitions with each other. Aristotle then says that time is the number of motion according to prior and posterior, but Plato that it is an eternal image flowing according to number of eternity abiding in one. To the one opposing according to number, to abiding, flowing, to paradigm, image. Here, then, we may see that Aristotle understood the conception of Plato concerning time far better than others. For what else is an eternal image flowing according to number? Then the subsistence of time according to number beheld neither as paradigmatic nor as monadic, but as having the relation of an image and subsisting according to the order of motion, i.e., according to prior and posterior. For the proper number of that which is moved, so far as moved, since it possesses another and another, introduces prior and posterior, and is bounded according to order. Aristotle, therefore, acutely perceiving this, and more clearly unfolding Plato's definition, says that time is the number of motion according to prior and posterior. Let's look at Plato's definition again. But Plato, that it is an eternal image flowing according to number of eternity abiding in one. To the one opposing according to number, to abiding, flowing, to paradigm, image. So that's just a comment on his definition, including these kind of contrary notions. But an eternal image flowing according to number of eternity abiding in one. I'm having a harder time than Simplicius seeing the direct and obvious connection to Aristotle's definition here. Let's in fact just read this section from Simplicius again. So again, Aristotle, it's the number of motion according to prior and posterior. According to Plato, it is an eternal image flowing according to number of eternity abiding in one. Okay, so here then we may see that Aristotle understood the conception of Plato concerning time far better than the others, for what else is an eternal image flowing according to number than the subsistence of time according to number? Eternal image flowing according to number. So that's the same as the subsistence of time according to number, I guess. Beheld neither as paradigmatic nor as monadic, but as having the relation of an image. So it's posterior to it's a number of the prior and posterior. So it's an image after, it's something that's done, a measure on top of this underlying motion. So what is that? An eternal image flowing according to number. Then the subsistence of time according to number. As having the relation of an image and subsisting according to the order of motion. The order of motion, I guess, invoking Plato's use of the term flowing. Okay. Subsisting according to the order of motion, i.e. according to prior and posterior. For the proper number of that which is moved, so far as moved, since it possesses another and another, introduces prior and posterior. The proper number of that which is moved, so far as it is moved, introduces prior and posterior. So the proper number of that which flows, or is moved, is going to be prior and posterior. That's what Aristotle includes. And is bounded according to order. Okay. Maybe that's the abiding in one. Bounded according to order. But that was supposed to indicate the ordinality of the prior and posterior number of motion. And I don't see that in Plato's definition here as obviously, but let's keep going. Aristotle, therefore, acutely perceiving this and more clearly unfolding Plato's definition, says that time is the number of motion according to prior and posterior. Hence, if the words according to number signify according to order, as Alexander conceives they do, they manifest nothing else than according to prior and posterior, for this is tactic number, or number according to order, just as monadic number is 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So tactic number, that's the same as like ordinal or ranking, like first, second, third versus, I guess it's cardinal, right? Would be just 1, 2, 3, where the numbers just stand by themselves. Number conceived insofar as it is a ranking of position is ordinal, and that's according to number. So he says, Simplicius says, Alexander interpreted Plato's according to number as according to order, the same as what Aristotle indicates, more or less. And so Simplicius is saying Alexander failed to see that according to number, according to order, is invoking the idea of prior and posterior. We'll keep going. We may also see how well Aristotle understood the word eternal according to the conception of Plato. For Plato says that animal itself possesses its perpetuity through eternity, which abides in one. But Aristotle says that eternity derives its appellation from being always, and that it possesses and comprehends the whole of time, thus beautifully unfolding the meaning of eternity abiding in one, and indicating that it illuminates all things with being and life. But the first participant of life is the first animal. Okay. So, some of that was a little bit tricky to follow. But there we have an attempt at a reconciliation of Plato's and Aristotle's definitions. We can sort of see some of that work, maybe. But that by which we number is different from that which is numbered. Going on with Aristotle, and as there is always another and another motion, so likewise with respect to time. But the whole of time, considered as subsisting at once, is the same. For the now is in reality one and the same, but its essence is different. Interesting. Okay, so I'm curious to see, for the now is in reality one and the same, but its essence is different. That's the same as like the substrate before was different on which the numbering occurred, but the numbering or the prior and posterior of motion is not the same as the substrate motion itself. So now the reality of the now is one and the same. The substrate of the now, I guess, is one and the same, but its essence is different, meaning our concept of it is different. That's not clear yet, so we'll go to the footnote. Just looking to see how long it is. Not super long. Okay. Footnote 6. Aristotle, having shown that time is something belonging to motion, for it is the numerable of motion according to prior and posterior, confirms their alliance from that flux which is common both to motion and time. For as there is always another and another motion, the first not remaining but being corrupted, so likewise the prior of time is always corrupted on the ascension of the posterior. It is evident also that not only the temporal priority of motion does not remain, but that this is likewise the case with the priority according to position. For in this, the prior being corrupted, the posterior accedes, though in the same magnitude in which the motion is produced, the prior and posterior remain together. For in those things alone which have their being in becoming to be, the prior is always corrupted on the ascension of the posterior. So, because motion is like a class under magnitude, the prior and posterior in magnitude remains together. It's just in motion and time that we have another and another, one thing being replaced by another. The prior and posterior, therefore, in motion, not according to the position of motion, but according to the extension of being, is time. Not so far as it is motion, but so far as it is prior and posterior. For with respect to the prior and posterior, according to the position of motion, through which, to him who walks from Athens to Thebes, the first motion is near to Athens, though this prior and posterior have their being in becoming to be, yet considered according to their relation to a permanent position, in a certain respect they appear to remain, when the motion also is beheld as coextended with the magnitude in which it exists. But when it is properly beheld as motion, according to its flux, and possessing its being in becoming to be, then having the prior as the past and the posterior as the future, it becomes chronicle or chronological. But Aristotle, having mentioned the agreement between time and motion, very properly adds their difference. For in motion, not only the prior is different from the posterior, which is common also to time, but motions also which exist together differ from each other. Some indeed in species, if one is corrupted, another increased, another changed in quality, but others in number only, if many are at once corrupted or increased or changed in quality. For motion is in that in which it is moved, so that such as are the things moved, so many are the motions. Okay, nevertheless, the same time. Okay, so motions are local, time is global. Nevertheless, the same time is everywhere, according to a certain signification of time. And time does not differ from time, for neither is the difference of those things in which there is time, whether according to species or according to number, the difference of time. For the things in Athens and the things in Corinth are in the same time, because the number of every definite motion is not time, in the same manner as there is a certain proper motion of every thing which is moved, but the number of all motions as one is time, since prior and posterior, so far as such, are one and the same in all things which subsist together. For they do not possess prior and posterior, so far as one is in this, and another in that, nor so far as one is corruption, another increase, and another change in quality, but according to that which is common so far as motion. Hence, things are said to be of the same age, because they subsist together in the same time, just as there is the same 5, though the things in which it exists are different. But difference, according to time, is alone from the difference of the nows, not the difference of particular motions. For in the assumption of these, time has its being when one of them is assumed as prior, but another posterior. But if a difference in the now produces the difference in time, the difference in time also will be according to prior and posterior alone. Of the time, however, which exists at once, one part is not prior and another posterior, and consequently in such time there is no difference. In short, time being the numerable of the first and simple motion of the heavens, according to the prior and posterior of this motion, numbers the prior and posterior in different motions according to one appropriate now. Hence also the same time is at once everywhere. And Aristotle himself also, as we shall shortly see, considers the now as not only numerable, but as that which numbers. But if this be the case, so far as it numbers, it will be without difference, but so far as it is numbered, it will be different. We may also say, so insofar as it is numbered, nows will be different, but so far as they number, nows will not be different. I'm not going to dwell on that too much. We may also say that different motions, though so far as they are motions of a certain kind, they differ from each other, yet that which is common to motion, viz. To have its subsistence in becoming to be, through which we assume prior and posterior in it, according to the extension of its being, and according to which time also is bounded, is one and the same. Okay. And we'll come back up here and find probably a spot to go ahead and wrap up before too long here, wherever it looks appropriate. All right, for the now is in reality one and the same, but its essence is different. So again, insofar as it is numbered, nows differ, but in reality they're one and the same. I feel like there's a possible deeper interpretation of Aristotle's philosophy of time than what Simplicius just gave. Just based on everything that Aristotle has said, it seems like we could include notions of observer dependency in interesting ways, but we're not going to now because we're going to go with Taylor and Simplicius and their interpretation. The now, however, measures time so far as it is prior and posterior. The now also subsists as partly the same and partly not the same, for so far as it is in another and another, it is different, but this was the now itself. But so far as the now is that which it once was, so far it is the same. For, as we have said, motion is consequent to magnitude and time to motion. In a similar manner, also, that which is borne along is consequent to a point, by which we recognize motion and the prior and posterior in it. But this is in reality the same, for it is either a point or a stone or something else of this kind, but is different in definition, just as the sophists assume that Coriscus in the Lyceum is different from Coriscus in the Forum, and this also is different because it is in a different place. But the now is consequent to that which is borne along in the same manner as time to motion. For by that which is borne along, we know prior and posterior in motion, but the now is, so far as prior and posterior are numerable. So that, in these, a real instant is the same, for that which is in motion is either prior or posterior, but the essence is different. Because the now is, so far as prior and posterior are numerable. And this is especially known, for motion is known through that which is moved, and lation through that which is borne along. Lation, I think, was locomotion generally, but maybe more specifically motion in a right line. Motion is known through that which is moved, and lation through that which is borne along. For that which is borne along is this particular thing, but this is not the case with motion. That which is called the now, therefore, is partly the same and partly not the same, for the like also may be said of that which is borne along. And we're going to go ahead and come back here, probably review this paragraph. I might read this section independently and get it a little bit firmer. I think the basic idea has worked well enough. Time is the number of motion according to prior and posterior. So not motion, it's a number of motion, but not just any number of motion, the number according to prior and posterior. That much is easy to follow. Some other details get a little bit hairier, and we'll be on the lookout for them next time. We might do a little bit more review, as I said, depending, but we'll pick back up in this general area. So thanks everybody for participating today. Have a good week. Is there any comment in the Jitsi call? I should always ask for that first. If you just jumped into the middle of this text, it might be a little bit confusing, or if you don't have a background with Aristotle, it could be. So yeah, I'd encourage everyone, watch the previous videos in the series, or read the text yourself. Simplicius is a very good commentator on Aristotle. Makes it a lot more clear than it is just from Aristotle's text himself. Alexander's good as well, but I think is not as good as Simplicius. So Taylor has basically done a favor for us in putting Simplicius's commentary together with Aristotle's text, and then adding a little bit on top of it himself. So, all right, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Have a good week, everybody.